The morning sun beat down on Camp Pendleton as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her gear one last time. The helicopter's rotors were already spinning, creating a whirlwind of dust and noise that made conversation nearly impossible. But the new guy, Corporal Jake Morrison, seemed determined to break the ice with the only female pilot on their squad. "So, Santos," Jake shouted over the engine noise, flashing what he probably thought was his most charming smile. "What's your call sign?" "Let me guess, something cute like angel or butterfly?" The other Marines in the unit exchanged glances. They had been working with Maria for over 2 years and knew better than to underestimate her based on her gender. At 5'6" with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, Maria might not look intimidating at first glance, but her reputation spoke for itself. Maria didn't respond immediately. She was focused on her pre-flight checklist, running through the same routine she had performed hundreds of times before. The UH-1Y Venom helicopter was her responsibility, and she took that responsibility seriously. Every bolt, every gauge, every system had to be perfect before she would even consider taking off with the crew. Jake, interpreting her silence as shyness, pressed on. "Come on, don't be modest. I bet it's something sweet. Maybe dove or songbird?" He nudged the Marine next to him, Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez, expecting support for his teasing. Carlos just shook his head and looked away. He had served 3 tours with Maria and had seen her fly through situations that would make most pilots wet themselves. He remembered the mission in Afghanistan, where she had landed a damaged helicopter under enemy fire to extract wounded soldiers. The enemy had been shooting at them from 3 different directions, and Maria had somehow managed to set the bird down in a space barely large enough for the aircraft. "You really don't know who you're talking to, do you?" whispered Private First Class Tommy Chun, the youngest member of their team. Tommy had heard the stories about Maria's previous deployments, but Jake was fresh from training and hadn't done his homework on his new squad mates. The crew chief, Gunnery Sergeant Michael Bull Patterson, walked up to perform his own equipment check. Bull was a 20-year veteran who had seen every type of Marine come and go. He was built like his nickname suggested, broad shoulders, thick neck, and hands that looked like they could crush walnuts. Despite his intimidating appearance, Bull had a soft spot for Marines who proved themselves through actions rather than words. "Morrison," Bull said without looking up from his clipboard, "you might want to save your questions for after the mission." But Jake was on a roll. He had been trying to impress his new unit since arriving at Camp Pendleton 3 weeks ago. Coming from a small town in Ohio, where he had been a high school football star, Jake was used to being the center of attention. The Marine Corps had been a humbling experience so far, and he was eager to establish his place in the social hierarchy of his new unit. "I'm just being friendly, Gunny," Jake said with a grin. "Getting to know my pilot. I mean, we're going to be flying together, right? Shouldn't we know each other's call signs?" Maria finally looked up from her checklist. Her dark eyes met Jake's blue ones, and for a moment, he felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't anger exactly, but it wasn't amusement either. It was the look of someone who had been underestimated many times before and had learned to use that to her advantage. "You really want to know my call sign?" Maria asked, her voice steady and calm despite the helicopter noise. "Absolutely," Jake replied, his confidence returning. "I love hearing the stories behind call signs. I bet yours is really interesting." The other Marines had stopped what they were doing. Even the helicopter crew chief had paused in his preparations. There was something in the air, a tension that Jake was completely oblivious to, but everyone else could feel. Maria set down her clipboard and walked closer to Jake. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who was completely comfortable in her own skin, someone who had nothing to prove, but everything to protect. Her flight suit was perfectly pressed, her boots polished to a mirror shine, and her bearing was that of a professional who took pride in every aspect of her service. "My call sign," Maria said, speaking just loud enough to be heard over the rotors, "isn't something I picked for myself. Call signs are earned. Morrison. They come from actions, not wishes." Jake nodded enthusiastically, completely missing the warning tone in her voice. Right, of course. So what did you do to earn yours? The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Bull stopped writing on his clipboard. Carlos closed his eyes and shook his head slightly. Tommy actually took a step back, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Maria studied Jake's face for a long moment. She could see the curiosity there, mixed with a casual disrespect that he probably didn't even realize he was showing. It was a look she had seen before from Marines who assumed that being a woman in a male-dominated field meant she had gotten there through luck or lowered standards rather than skill and determination. The mission brief is in 10 minutes, Maria said finally, turning back to her helicopter. We'll save story time for after we complete the objective. But Jake wasn't ready to let it go. He had started this conversation, and his pride wouldn't let him back down now. Come on, Santos. It can't be that big a secret. What's your call sign? The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the helicopter engines and the distant noise of other aircraft preparing for takeoff. Every Marine in the immediate area seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Maria turned around one more time, and this time there was something different in her expression. It wasn't anger or annoyance. It was the look of someone who had made a decision, someone who was about to teach an important lesson. You want to know my call sign, Morrison? She asked, her voice carrying a weight that made even Jake pause for a moment. Yeah, he said, though some of his earlier bravado had faded. Maria looked him straight in the eye, her gaze never wavering. Around them, the other Marines waited to see how their female pilot would handle yet another challenge to her credibility and competence. Dark Valkyrie, Maria said simply, her voice cutting through the helicopter noise like a blade through silk. The effect was immediate and profound. Jake's cocky smile vanished, as if someone had flipped a switch. His face went pale, and he took an involuntary step backward. The name hit him like a physical blow, and suddenly he understood why everyone else had been trying to warn him. Dark Valkyrie. Even fresh Marines knew that call sign. It was legend in the Corps, spoken of in hushed tones in barracks and mess halls. Jake had heard the stories during his training, but he had never connected them to the quiet, professional woman standing in front of him. Jesus Christ, Jake whispered, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. Bull Patterson allowed himself a small smile. He had been wondering how long it would take the new kid to put his foot in his mouth, and Jake had exceeded even his expectations. Now you're getting it, Morrison, Bull muttered. The story of Dark Valkyrie was already legendary throughout the Marine Corps, but few people knew the woman behind the call sign personally. 3 years earlier, Captain Maria Santos had been a first lieutenant leading a rescue mission in Afghanistan. Intelligence had indicated that a Navy SEAL team was pinned down by enemy forces in a valley surrounded by mountains on 3 sides. The mission was considered impossible by every pilot who looked at it. The landing zone was too small, the enemy fire too intense, and the weather conditions too dangerous. 2 previous rescue attempts had been turned back, and the SEAL team was running out of time and ammunition. Maria had volunteered for the mission despite being told that it was essentially a suicide run. She had studied the terrain, the weather patterns, and the enemy positions for hours, looking for any advantage she could find. When she finally took off in her UH-1Y Venom, she was flying alone except for a crew chief and a Navy corpsman. What happened next became the stuff of legends. Maria had flown her helicopter into that valley like something out of a nightmare for the enemy forces below. She used the mountain terrain to mask her approach, flying so low that her skids actually scraped the ground at several points. When she reached the landing zone, she discovered that it was indeed too small for a normal landing. So she didn't land normally. Instead, Maria had performed a maneuver that was technically possible, but practically insane. She had hovered the helicopter with just the rear wheels touching a rocky outcropping, while the front of the aircraft hung over a cliff face. The angle was so steep that the SEAL team had to literally climb up into the helicopter cabin. But the real reason for her call sign came during the extraction. As the SEALs were climbing aboard, enemy forces had surrounded the landing zone and opened fire from multiple positions. A normal pilot would have taken off immediately, leaving the remaining SEALs behind. Maria had done something different. She had used her helicopter as a weapon of war. With the aircraft still partially loaded with personnel, Maria had swung the tail rotor toward the enemy positions, using the massive blades as a deadly sweeping weapon. The downwash from her rotors had created a dust storm that blinded the enemy gunners, while the psychological effect of a massive helicopter bearing down on them had broken their will to fight. When one SEAL was hit by enemy fire and fell back onto the rocky outcropping, Maria had done the unthinkable. She had lowered the helicopter again, this time to an angle that should have been impossible to maintain. The aircraft had been tilted so far forward that the main rotor was only feet away from the cliff face, but she had held it steady while her crew chief rappelled down to retrieve the wounded SEAL. The entire rescue had taken less than 4 minutes, but those 4 minutes had saved 6 lives and eliminated an entire enemy position. When Maria finally flew out of that valley, she had done so under heavy fire with a damaged helicopter and wounded passengers, but she had completed a mission that 3 other pilots had deemed impossible. The call sign Dark Valkyrie had come from the enemy fighters who survived the encounter. In their radio communications, which were intercepted by intelligence services, they described the helicopter and its pilot as a dark angel of death that had descended from the mountains to claim the souls of warriors. The Valkyrie reference came from Marine intelligence officers who were familiar with Norse mythology and the legend of warrior women who chose which fighters would live and die in battle. Standing on the tarmac at Camp Pendleton, Jake Morrison was beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. The woman he had been casually joking with was a decorated combat veteran with more flight hours in hostile territory than most pilots accumulated in their entire careers. I didn't know. Jake stammered, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. Maria studied his face for a moment, seeing the genuine shock and embarrassment there. She had dealt with countless young Marines who had made assumptions about her based on her gender, and she had learned to distinguish between malicious disrespect and simple ignorance. Most people don't, Maria said simply, and that's exactly how I like it. Carlos Rodriguez stepped forward, sensing an opportunity to help his new squad mate understand the situation. Morrison, Dark Valkyrie has more confirmed enemy kills than most infantry platoons. She's flown rescue missions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. When other pilots say a mission is impossible, they call her. Tommy Chin nodded enthusiastically. My drill instructor at Paris Island used her missions as examples of what Marines are supposed to accomplish when facing impossible odds. I never thought I'd actually serve with her. But Maria was already moving on, her attention returning to her pre-flight preparations. She had a mission to complete, and dwelling on past accomplishments wouldn't help her crew get home safely. The brief starts in 5 minutes, she announced. I suggest everyone focus on today's mission instead of old stories. Jake stood there for a moment, trying to process what he had just learned. The quiet, professional woman he had been casually teasing was one of the most decorated pilots in the Marine Corps. Worse, he had been treating her exactly like the kind of person who assumed women didn't belong in combat roles. Santos, Jake called out as Maria climbed into the pilot's seat to continue her checks. She looked back at him, her expression neutral, but not unfriendly. I owe you an apology, Jake said, his voice carrying a sincerity that hadn't been there before. I was out of line, and I'm sorry. Maria nodded once, accepting the apology without making a big production of it. Apology accepted, Morrison. Just remember that call signs are earned through actions. Everyone in this unit has proven themselves through service and sacrifice. That includes you, or you wouldn't be here. As Maria returned to her preparations, Jake realized that she had just given him something valuable. She hadn't humiliated him in front of the other Marines, even though she easily could have. Instead, she had taught him an important lesson about respect and assumptions while still maintaining the team cohesion that would be essential for their mission. Bull Patterson walked over to Jake and handed him his gear bag. Stick around long enough, Morrison and You might earn a call sign of your own. Just make sure it's one you can live with. The helicopter's engines reached full power, and Maria's voice came through the comm system with a calm professionalism that had made her legendary. All personnel, we're moving to the brief in 2 minutes. Lock and low Marines. We have work to do. The mission briefing room was filled with the controlled tension that always preceded a dangerous operation. Colonel James Mitchell stood at the front of the room, pointing to a large map of the Syrian border region where their target was located. The mission was complex. Extract a CIA operative who had been gathering intelligence on terrorist weapon shipments, but had gone dark 3 days ago. The operative's last known position was here, Colonel Mitchell said, tapping a point on the map with his laser pointer. Intelligence suggests he may be wounded and hiding in this cave system. The area is crawling with hostile forces, and we have a narrow window of opportunity before they discover his location. Jake Morrison sat in the front row, still feeling the weight of his earlier encounter with Maria. He had spent the last hour researching everything he could find about Dark Valkyrie's previous missions, and what he had discovered had completely changed his perspective. The woman sitting 2 seats away from him wasn't just a pilot. She was a warrior with a reputation that extended far beyond the Marine Corps. The terrain makes this extraction extremely challenging, the colonel continued. The cave system is located on a cliff face approximately 200 feet above the valley floor. There are no suitable landing zones within a 2-mile radius, and enemy forces control all the high ground in the area. Sergeant Rodriguez raised his hand. Sir, what's the plan for insertion and extraction? Colonel Mitchell looked directly at Maria. Staff Sergeant Santos will be using a technique she pioneered during Operation Enduring Freedom. We're calling it a vertical extraction under fire. Jake felt his stomach drop. He had read about Maria's vertical extractions, but he had assumed they were exaggerated war stories. The idea of hovering a helicopter next to a cliff face while under enemy fire seemed like something out of an action movie, not a real military operation. The mission window is 30 minutes, Colonel Mitchell explained. Intelligence indicates that enemy reinforcements are moving into the area. If we're not out by then, we'll be facing overwhelming odds. Maria stood up and walked to the map. As she moved, Jake noticed that every Marine in the room gave her their complete attention. This wasn't the casual respect given to a superior officer. This was the focused attention reserved for someone who had proven themselves in combat repeatedly. The approach will be from the northeast, Maria said, tracing a route on the map with her finger. We'll use the morning sun to mask our approach and the mountain ridges to avoid radar detection. The extraction point is here, approximately 15 feet from the cave entrance. How do we get down to the operative? Asked Tommy Chun. We don't, Maria replied. The operative comes to us. I'll position the helicopter so that the cabin door is level with the cave entrance. The aircraft will be hovering with the nose pointed down at roughly a 40-degree angle. Jake's mouth went dry. He had never even heard of anyone attempting to hover a helicopter at a 40-degree angle, let alone maintain that position long enough for someone to climb aboard. The physics alone seemed impossible, but Maria was discussing it as if it were a routine maneuver. What's our defensive plan? Bull Patterson asked from the back of the room. Minimal engagement, Maria answered. Our goal is to get in and out before the enemy knows we're there. If we're discovered, I'll use the helicopter's downwash and rotor effect to create confusion while you provide covering fire from the cabin. Colonel Mitchell stepped forward again. I want everyone to understand that this mission is entirely voluntary. The technique we're using has only been successfully completed 3 times, all by Staff Sergeant Santos. Anyone who has concerns about the approach should speak up now. The room was silent. Jake looked around at his squad mates and realized that none of them had any intention of backing down. These were Marines who had served multiple combat tours, and they trusted Maria's abilities completely. Sir, Jake said, surprising himself by speaking up. What's the backup plan if the helicopter is damaged during the extraction? Maria turned to look at him, and Jake saw something in her eyes that he hadn't noticed before. It was the look of someone who had calculated every possible risk and had contingency plans for scenarios he couldn't even imagine. If the aircraft is damaged, but still flyable, we complete the mission and deal with repairs later, Maria said. If the aircraft is too damaged to fly, we defend our position and wait for backup. And if backup can't reach us? Jake pressed, needing to understand the full scope of what they were about to attempt. Then we adapt and overcome, Maria replied simply. That's what Marines do. The briefing continued for another 30 minutes, covering everything from communication protocols to emergency medical procedures. But Jake found himself focusing on Maria's demeanor throughout the discussion. She answered every question with the confidence of someone who had faced similar challenges before and survived. As the briefing concluded, the Marines began filing out of the room to prepare for departure. Jake lingered, hoping for a chance to speak with Maria privately. When the room had mostly cleared, he approached her as she was gathering her notes. "Staff Sergeant," Jake said formally. Maria looked up from her paperwork. "What can I do for you, Morrison?" "I wanted to ask you something," Jake said, then paused, trying to find the right words. "How do you do it? How do you fly missions that other pilots say are impossible?" Maria studied his face for a moment, seeing genuine curiosity rather than the casual skepticism he had shown earlier. "Morrison, what's the first thing they teach you about marksmanship?" Jake was puzzled by the change of subject, but answered anyway. "Know your target and what's beyond it." "Exactly," Maria nodded. "Flying is the same way. I don't fly impossible missions, Morrison. I fly calculated risks based on thorough preparation and complete understanding of my aircraft's capabilities. When other pilots say something is impossible, it's usually because they're not willing to accept the level of risk involved. But the extraction technique you're planning," Jake said, hovering at a 40-degree angle next to a cliff face. "That's not just risky, it's insane." Maria finished with a slight smile. "Maybe, but it's also effective. I've practiced that maneuver hundreds of times in training and used it successfully in combat. I know exactly how my aircraft will respond in those conditions." Jake nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "So, it's not really impossible. It's just that most pilots won't attempt it." "Most pilots shouldn't attempt it," Maria corrected. "It requires specific training, experience, and a complete understanding of the aircraft's limitations. But for someone who has put in the time to master the technique, it's just another tool in the toolbox." As they walked toward the hangar together, Jake realized that his perception of Maria had completely changed over the course of the morning. She wasn't just a skilled pilot who happened to be female. She was a warrior who had pushed the boundaries of what was possible in military aviation. Her gender was irrelevant to her abilities, just as his small-town football achievements were irrelevant to his performance as a Marine. "Morrison," Maria said as they reached the hangar, "you're going to do fine on this mission. Just remember that being part of a team means trusting your squad mates to do their jobs while you focus on doing yours." Jake nodded, feeling a confidence he hadn't experienced since joining the unit. For the first time since arriving at Camp Pendleton, he felt like he might actually belong with these Marines, the UH-1 Venom helicopter cut through the morning sky like a metallic predator, its twin engines humming with barely contained power. Inside the cabin, Jake Morrison gripped his rifle and tried to calm his nerves as the Syrian landscape rushed past below them. This was his first real combat mission, and he was flying with a legend. Maria's voice came through the comm system, calm and professional despite the fact that they were heading into hostile territory. 5 minutes to target. Everyone check your gear one more time. Jake looked around the cabin at his squad mates. Bull Patterson was methodically checking his ammunition pouches with the practiced efficiency of a 20-year veteran. Carlos Rodriguez was studying a satellite photo of their target area, memorizing every detail that might matter during the extraction. Tommy Chun was quiet, focused, but Jake could see the excitement in his eyes at being part of such an important mission. "Morrison," Maria's voice cut through his thoughts. "You're my door gunner for this mission. When we reach the extraction point, your job is to watch the valley floor and report any enemy movement. Don't worry about the cliff face. I'll handle that part." "Copy that, Dark Valkyrie," Jake replied, using her call sign with the respect it deserved. The landscape below them was a patchwork of brown and tan, broken by rocky ridges and deep valleys carved by ancient rivers. It looked peaceful from their altitude, but Jake knew that enemy fighters could be hiding behind any rock formation or inside any of the small buildings scattered throughout the region. 2 minutes, Maria announced. Rodriguez, Chun, prepare the extraction harnesses. Patterson, confirm communications with base. Jake moved to the open cabin door and positioned himself behind the mounted machine gun. The wind whipped through the aircraft as they descended toward their target altitude. Below them, he could see the cliff face that contained their objective, a dark scar in the mountainside that looked impossible to approach. There, Maria said through the comm, I can see the cave entrance. Morrison, do you have eyes on any enemy positions? Jake scanned the valley floor through his weapon scope, looking for any signs of hostile activity. The terrain was perfect for ambushes, with hundreds of potential hiding spots among the rocks and vegetation. But, for now, everything appeared quiet. Valley floor is clear, Jake reported. No visible movement. Copy that. Everyone hold on, we're going in. What happened next would stay with Jake for the rest of his life. Maria approached the cliff face at an angle that seemed to defy the laws of physics, using the helicopter's rotor wash to create lift and stability in ways that Jake had never imagined possible. As they got closer to the cave entrance, the aircraft began to tilt forward, the nose pointing down toward the valley floor below. Jake's stomach dropped as he realized they were now hovering in a position where the slightest mistake would send them crashing into the rocks below. But Maria's control was absolute. The helicopter held its position as steady as if it were parked on solid ground. Target acquired, Rodriguez called out. I can see the operative in the cave entrance. He's conscious and mobile. Through the cabin door, Jake could see into the dark mouth of the cave where a figure in civilian clothes was waving at them. The CIA operative looked exhausted and wounded, but he was clearly alive and ready for extraction. Chun, deploy the extraction harness, Maria ordered. Morrison, keep scanning for threats. That's when everything went wrong. Contact, Jake shouted into his comm as muzzle flashes erupted from multiple positions on the valley floor. We've got enemy fighters moving in from the east and south. Bullets began pinging off the helicopter's armored hull as enemy forces opened fire from concealed positions. Jake returned fire with the door gun, trying to suppress the shooters while his squad mates worked to extract the operative. How much time do you need? Maria asked, her voice still steady despite the chaos erupting around them. 30 seconds, Rodriguez replied as he helped the wounded operative into the extraction harness. 30 seconds. Jake knew from his training that 30 seconds was an eternity in combat, especially when they were sitting motionless in a hovering helicopter. But Maria held her position, using her aircraft's bulk to shield the extraction team, while Jake provided covering fire. More contacts, Jake called out. Vehicles approaching from the north. Through his scope, Jake could see military trucks racing across the desert floor, filled with armed fighters. They would reach the base of the cliff in less than 2 minutes, turning their precarious extraction into a full-scale battle. Rodriguez, status, Maria demanded. Operative is secure. We're ready for extraction. But as Rodriguez spoke, Jake saw something that made his blood run cold. One of the approaching trucks had stopped, and fighters were setting up what looked like a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. RPG, Jake screamed into his comm. RPG team setting up at 2 o'clock. Maria didn't hesitate. Without warning, she pulled the helicopter away from the cliff face in a maneuver that should have been impossible. The aircraft spun away from the mountain in a controlled fall that used gravity and rotor mechanics to build speed faster than Jake would have believed possible. The RPG rounds sailed past where they had been hovering just seconds before, exploding against the cliff face in a shower of rock and flame. If they had been there when it hit, none of them would have survived. Everyone secure? Maria asked as she leveled the aircraft and began flying towards safety. All accounted for, Bull Patterson reported. Operative is wounded, but stable. Jake looked back at the cliff face, now small in the distance, and tried to comprehend what had just happened. Maria had held a helicopter in a position that defied physics while under enemy fire, extracted a wounded operative from an impossible location, and then escaped from a rocket attack through flying skills that belonged in legends rather than reality. Morrison, Maria's voice came through the comm. How did you spot that RPG team so quickly? I saw them setting up the launcher, Jake replied, still breathing hard from the adrenaline. Lucky timing, I guess. No such thing as luck in combat, Maria said. You did good work back there. You kept us alive. As they flew toward the safety of friendly territory, Jake realized that something fundamental had changed during those few minutes over the Syrian desert. He had proven himself in combat alongside some of the Marine Corps' most elite warriors, and he had done it competently. But more importantly, he had learned what it truly meant to serve alongside someone like Dark Valkyrie. Maria Santos wasn't just a skilled pilot or a decorated veteran. She was the kind of warrior who made impossible missions routine through preparation, skill, and absolute dedication to bringing her team home alive. Dark Valkyrie, Jake said into his comm as the Syrian landscape faded behind them. What is it, Morrison? Thank you, Jake said simply. For everything. Thank me when we're back on base, Maria replied. We're not home yet 3 months later. Jake Morrison stood in the same hangar where he had first met Maria Santos, but everything had changed. The naive kid from Ohio who had made jokes about call signs was gone, replaced by a seasoned Marine who had earned his place among some of the Corps' most elite warriors. The mission board showed his name listed for another extraction operation, this time as team leader for a group of new Marines fresh from training. Jake looked at the roster and felt a familiar flutter of nerves. Leading Marines in combat was a responsibility he didn't take lightly, especially after everything he had learned from Dark Valkyrie. Morrison, a voice called from behind him. Jake turned to see Colonel Mitchell approaching with a folder in his hand, and an expression that Jake had learned to associate with important news. Sir, Jake replied, snapping to attention. At ease, Marine. I have something for you. Colonel Mitchell opened the folder and pulled out an official document. Your new orders. You've been selected for flight training. Jake's eyes widened as he read the papers. Flight school was incredibly competitive, and most Marines who applied were turned down. The fact that he was being offered the opportunity after just 3 months in the unit was almost unbelievable. Sir, I don't understand. I'm infantry, not aviation. Colonel Michel smiled. Staff Sergeant Santos recommended you personally. She said you showed exceptional situational awareness during the Syrian operation and that you have the temperament for flight operations under pressure. Jake looked across the hangar to where Maria was conducting her pre-flight inspection on a new helicopter. She glanced up and gave him a small nod before returning to her work. The gesture was typical of her. No big production, no speeches, just quiet professional recognition of his potential. There's something else, Colonel Mitchell continued. The other members of your team from the Syrian mission have submitted a recommendation for you to receive a call sign. Jake felt his heart skip a beat. Earning a call sign was one of the highest honors a Marine could receive from his peers. It meant that his squad mates considered him worthy of the kind of respect that could only be earned through combat performance. What is it, sir? Hawkeye, Colonel Mitchell said, for spotting that RPG team before they can engage. Rodriguez said your warning saved the entire team. Jake stared at the document in his hands, reading his new call sign over and over again. 3 months ago, he had been making jokes about what he assumed would be cute nicknames for female pilots. Now he understood that call signs represented something sacred, recognition from fellow warriors that you had proven yourself when it mattered most. Hawkeye, Colonel Mitchell said with a grin. Report to Staff Sergeant Santos for your final mission briefing before you ship out to flight school. As Jake walked across the hangar toward Maria's helicopter, he thought about everything that had changed since that first embarrassing encounter. He had learned to see past stereotypes and assumptions. He had discovered what it meant to serve alongside true professionals. Most importantly, He had proven to himself that he belonged among these Marines. "Congratulations on the call sign," Maria said without looking up from her checklist as Jake approached. "And congratulations on flight school." "Thank you, Dark Valkyrie, for everything." This time, Maria did look up, and Jake saw something in her expression that he had never seen before: pride. Not the boastful pride of someone showing off, but the quiet satisfaction of a teacher whose student had exceeded expectations. "You earned it, Hawkeye. The call sign, the flight school recommendation, all of it. You went from making assumptions about people to saving their lives in combat. That's not a small thing." Jake nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with his new status. "I wanted to ask you something before I leave for training." "Shoot." "That first day when I was being such an idiot about your call sign," Jake said, feeling embarrassed even thinking about it. "You could have humiliated me in front of the whole team. Instead, you taught me a lesson while still maintaining team cohesion." "Why?" Maria finished her checklist and turned to face Jake directly. "Because humiliating you wouldn't have made you a better Marine. Teaching you what call signs really represent, that did. Every Marine in this unit has made mistakes, Morrison. What matters is whether you learn from them." "What about the flight school recommendation? Why did you recommend me?" "Because you showed something during that Syrian mission that can't be taught," Maria replied. "When the shooting started, you didn't panic. You did your job, kept your eyes open, and saved lives. Those are the qualities we need in our pilots." Jake felt a surge of gratitude toward the woman who had become more than just his commanding officer. She had become a mentor and an example of what it meant to be a professional warrior. "I won't let you down," Jake said. "I know you won't," Maria replied. "Just remember what we talked about during your first mission briefing. Know your aircraft, know your limitations, and never attempt something in combat that you haven't mastered in training." As Jake prepared to leave for flight school, he realized that Maria Santos had given him something more valuable than flight training or career advancement. She had shown him what it meant to earn respect through competence and character rather than demanding it through rank or gender or background. 2 years later, First Lieutenant Jake "Hawk" I. Morrison would return to Camp Pendleton as a qualified helicopter pilot, ready to fly the same impossible missions that had once seemed like legend. And when he did, he would carry with him the lessons he had learned from Dark Valkyrie. That call signs are earned through actions, that assumptions can be deadly, and that the best warriors are those who lift up their fellow Marines rather than tearing them down. But that day was still in the future. For now, Jake simply saluted the woman who had changed his life, picked up his gear, and walked toward his new destiny, knowing that somewhere in the skies above Syria, another impossible mission was being completed by a pilot whose call sign struck fear into the hearts of enemies and pride into the hearts of Marines. The legend of Dark Valkyrie would continue, inspiring new generations of warriors to push beyond what they thought was possible. And Jake Morrison, once a cocky kid from Ohio who thought he knew everything, would carry that inspiration with him for the rest of his career, always remembering the lesson he learned on a dusty tarmac at Camp Pendleton. Never judge a Marine by anything other than their actions, and always be ready to have your assumptions proven completely wrong.